Well, for about the 20 years preceding when I started this YouTube channel in earnest, I ran a blog on Victorian science fiction, and for a little while went on Disney as well. And as a consequence of that, I have ended up on a lot of email lists for press releases for review copies of this movie and this book and that book, and interviews with those people and those other people and so on. And almost never does it have anything to do with the actual subject of my blog. But I still get those emails, even though my blog is essentially dead. And like the other week, I actually got an offer to review something that fits with the theme of what I talk about, which is this book right here, Palm Springs Tiki by Sven Kirsten and Peter Moruzzi, cover here by Josh Agel. And I thought, you know what, sure, I'll review a book about Palm Springs Tiki, even though, in the interest of fairness, I have never been to Palm Springs. I have never been there. I know practically nothing about it, other than that it is the venue of, and the biggest, or was the venue, of the biggest annual Tiki gathering, Tiki Oasis, at the Caliente Tropics Resort. And I thought, you know what, okay, fine. This might actually be good, because I don't know anything about Palm Springs. I've never been there. Let's see how a complete novice to Palm Springs reads this book and understands this book. And I will say from the outset what it is. This is a fine coffee table book. It will sit on your coffee table in your home tiki bar, and it will look good while your friends flip through it, and you tell them about how great Tiki Oasis was. And how awesome the Caliente Tropics Resort is, and all that sort of stuff. That's what this book is for. That's what this book is about. Is to sit there and look good while you talk about your Tiki adventures and Tiki travels. That's the purpose of it, and I think it serves that purpose fine. Now, if you are looking for like an actual, like a historical study on Palm Springs and Palm Springs style, aesthetic, architecture, and the situation of Tiki in that, and a really in-depth dive into Palm Springs Tiki bars and Tiki personalities and that sort of thing, you are probably not going to find it in this book. I didn't come out with a very clear idea of the history of Tiki in Palm Springs when I was reading this. It reads much more like a general history on Tiki and where that happens to intersect with people and places from Palm Springs. And which is fair enough, because Sven Kirsten is the great historian of Tiki. I've mentioned him before in some online disagreements I've had with him about cultural studies. But I don't at all have anything negative to say about his scholarship as far as like the history of Tiki goes. And so he's written book after book about the history of Tiki and the aesthetics of Tiki and so on. So this feels like it's a bit of an appendix to those books. If you want to understand Tiki, you read his other books, and then you will add this on top of that for where it intersects with Palm Springs history. But as far as like a comprehensive history of Palm Springs, I'm a little bit fuzzy on where exactly Palm Springs started and why it is what it is and that sort of thing. It's touched on a little bit in here with personalities like Eden Abez and so on. But not really comprehensive history of that. Not really a comprehensive look at like Tiki venues and things like that in Palm Springs either. I did learn some surprising connections. Like there are some interesting connections with like interior designers like Cliff and Lou Sawyer, like clothing designers like Walter Clark and so on, who were based in Palm Springs. There's interesting history that intersects with that, and getting a glimpse of how sort of somewhat influential Palm Springs was in the development of Tiki. But as far as like, actual bars and places, like I found myself like having to grab my phone and look up like, do some of these places even still exist? Because like even basic things like it was open from this point to that point isn't even covered in this book. A real lack of photos, a real lack of serious discussion. I thought the most interesting chapters were actually on the stuff that wasn't made. Like there was all these plans for sort of like creating these massive lakes in Palm Springs and putting like tropical islands in there and having like little resort hotels and campgrounds and stuff like that. That was one of the more interesting chapters actually, because what he showed in terms of like these concept paintings and things was all there was. Whereas when it talks about the actual bars, like almost no photos of these actual establishments. A few matchbooks and things like that. I think one of the biggest offenders in this book, as it were, was Aloha Joe's, which the authors go on about how this place was this incredible collaboration of all these very talented people in tiki culture and tiki history, of managers and restaurateurs and set designers and so on. And there's like practically no photos of it in the book. There's photos of other work done by these people, and that's the thing. Like, there's lots of photos of things that are not from Palm Springs. There's photos of bars in New York and Philadelphia and other places in California and so on. And I can understand expanding this to like the whole sort of Mojave Valley area, not just the civic area of Palm Springs. But it's like stuff from all over the place, and just how it intersects with Palm Springs at these little junctures throughout here. And I really would have liked more about the actual bars and hotels and things in Palm Springs itself, and more comprehensive photos, and their advertising and that sort of thing, and even like maps and stuff like that, just so I can understand the layout of these places and the layout of the town and all these sorts of things that I, as somebody who's never been there, doesn't know. But then why are you buying this book if you've never been there, right? There were a few things some interesting insights and thoughts that I had while reading this. I did like, actually, the early chapters, even though it didn't tell as much the history of Palm Springs itself as I would have liked. There was some interesting discussion about sort of themed California architecture and how that kind of developed and how Tiki situates in that. And more specifically, this development towards sort of the Spanish Mission Revival style as being sort of the de facto California architectural style. And then how Tiki sort of situates in that and goes hand in hand with the Spanish Mission Revival style. And, thinking about that, like, that would be an interesting study to, I guess, be a different book about, would be that intersection between that Spanish Mission Revival style and Tiki, and how recursive it was, because, the Spanish Mission Revival is sort of, it's a revival style, but it's indigenous to California, in the sense of it's harkening back to actual California history and the Spanish colonizers. And then Tiki comes in as sort of this ersatz vision from Hawaii, from Polynesia. Excuse me. And then that Spanish mission style, because it's so popular in California, it ends up being exported back out to Polynesia. So you get like the El Mirador Hotel in Palm Springs, which is a Spanish mission style hotel with a tiki bar in it. And then you go to Hawaii, and there is the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, the Pink Palace of the Pacific on Waikiki Beach in Spanish Mission Revival style. So I thought like that kind of intersection between those two styles and a bit of sort of recursive back and forth there would be an interesting subject to explore. Maybe in a different book than this one. This one is sort of like touched on to like, that's an interesting connection I never really thought about before. Another one that I thought was interesting was the commercialization and standardization of Tiki in the mid-1950s. And he actually alludes to, like most things, discusses very, very briefly in the book itself, that when in the late 1950s, the demand for Tiki statues outstripped supply from the islands, American artists were hired to create Tikis inspired by oceanic art books and other available sources. The results were a new fusion of authentic Polynesian art with modernist and cartoony influences. Ultimately, these hybrids became restaurant logos on menus, matchbooks, ashtrays, and decorative statues, creating a uniquely American pop art genre. I thought that was interesting because, like, this is in the chapter. In fact, you get to this at chapter 8 in the book here, where it's like the previous chapters are talking about this evolution towards the sort of themed architecture of tropical escapism. And then mid-1950s, you get this adoption of A-frames and Tiki statues themselves, like the actual Polynesian carvings. And that sort of coalesces this sort of diffuse South Pacific sort of aesthetic, the beachcomber aesthetic, that's mixing in with sort of African and Caribbean aesthetics and so on. And it coalesces all of that into tiki culture, mid-century tiki culture and aesthetics with the A-frames and the tiki statues and everything. And sort of that as like this sort of contraction of the style and sort of commercialization of it and standardization of the tiki aesthetic. I thought it would be another interesting avenue of exploration. This idea that it was sort of, in a way, a bit fresher and newer and more experimental in the pre-tiki phase, and then it gets standardized as tiki with the introduction of these certain elements, the tiki statue and the A-frame and that sort of thing. I thought that was a bit interesting as someone who is running a pre-tiki group based on like pre-World War II tropical escapist aesthetics. And finally, there was this one part that actually made me laugh out loud when I read it, which was on the El Tiki, this fusion of Mexican and tiki style, with the idea that, well, Mexico also borders the Pacific, and why can't you blend that with the Polynesian style? And so in the early 1960s, Tiki, the Polynesian god of the artists, inspired many novice carvers to fashion their own version of this idol. El Tiki and its decor were exemplary for this American pop culture in two ways. First, in the self-made quality conceived by someone with no art or restaurant experience. Second, El Tiki, which is a tiki with a sombrero, exemplified the freewheeling attitude towards mixing elements of different cultures to form a unique new style of exotic art. And that made me laugh out loud, because I'm okay with that. But that is the sort of thing that if you posted something like that on a tiki group today on Facebook, then, no offense, but like Sven Kirsten, or at least his disciples, would absolutely pillory you over that on Facebook groups today. Like the tiki purists would just absolutely rake you over the coals for trying to fuse tiki with, you know, Universal monsters, with mid-century monster kitsch, with rockabilly, with Star Wars, any of that sort of stuff, like the geeky tikis, that sort of thing. Like, that's exactly the same thing, right? It's that fusion of this ersatz Americanized encounter with Polynesia, fusing with other cultural elements, whether that's El Tiki and Mexico, or whether that's Star Wars, or whatever. And he speaks so glowingly about it in this book, because it's old and cool, and that makes it okay. But if you do it today with like the Frankenstein monster sipping out of a tiki mug, or Han Solo sipping out of a tiki mug, or whatever, now it's bad, and that's not tiki. Monsters are not tiki. It's just like, okay, sure. So it seems a little selective about what is or is not in the circle of tiki there. So that part actually made me laugh out loud when I read that. Those are just some thoughts and things I had, and some venues of further exploration, some ideas that it gave me, that commercialization and standardization of the tiki aesthetic in the mid-50s, those intersections between California mission style and tiki, the very apologetic sort of when they mixed tiki with other things in the past, right? Just some thoughts I had coming out of this, because the book itself, unfortunately, lacks a lot of that detailed information that I would have liked about Palm Springs. Which, again, comes back to the question, why would you buy this if you didn't go to Palm Springs, if you didn't know anything about Palm Springs? And I think that's who this is for, mostly. And the chapter that shows the most obvious love of subject, and you can feel the most passion coming out on the page for, is actually the last chapter, where it's talking about the modern Palm Springs tiki scene. Caliente Tropics Resort, the Tiki Oasis convention, about Shag, about these various events and stuff, which, you know, Sven Kirsten himself goes to. In fact, he put photos of himself in his book, in that chapter, as though to establish his credibility that he's there in the Palm Springs tiki scene. That's who this book is really for. Is that if you have gone to Palm Springs and you already know all this stuff, and you're just looking for this fun book, this souvenir book, to put it on your coffee table and have it look good while your friends flip through it while you talk about when you go to Palm Springs for your vacation and go to Tiki Oasis, stuff like that. So I think that's where this book is about. I mean, aesthetically, this book is beautiful. I mean, you got the Shag cover, you've got like this absolute wealth of photos and things like that. It's just yeah, if you're looking for like detailed blueprints and photos and things of Palm Springs tiki bars, you're not going to find that in this book. This book is the book that's meant to be the nice souvenir to show your friends as it sits on your coffee table in your home tiki bar.